Imagine you are a sailor in the 17th century. You are navigating the most feared waters on Earth, the Cape of Good Hope. The sky has gone black in the middle of the afternoon. The waves around you are not waves anymore. They are moving mountains, 40 feet high, and the wind is screaming through the rigging at speeds that can tear a mast clean off its base. And then, through the mist, something appears that should not exist. A ship. Old, ancient even. Her sails are the color of dried blood, and she is moving directly against the wind, straight toward you, glowing faintly in the darkness like she is lit from somewhere inside her own hull. Your crew starts screaming, not because of the storm anymore, because every sailor who has ever worked these waters knows the legend. To see this ship is to see your own death sentence. Some of your crewmates drop to their knees. Others beg you to turn the wheel, to run, to do anything except stay on this course. Because that ship has a name. And for over 300 years, sightings of it have been written down, signed, and sworn to be true by everyone from ordinary fishermen to a future king of England. It is the most famous, most documented, and most terrifying ghost ship in the history of the sea. It is the Flying Dutchman. Is it an ancient curse laid down upon one doomed captain? A mass hallucination shared by hundreds of witnesses across 3 centuries? Or is it something science can finally explain? A trick of light and temperature that has fooled sailors for generations. Today, on Bilge Beyond, we are sailing straight into the eye of the storm to find out what is really haunting the waters of the Cape of Good Hope. Before we go any further into the darkest legend in maritime history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week we dive into the ocean's greatest mysteries, the wrecks, the curses, and the stories that history tried to bury at the bottom of the sea. And you do not want to miss what is coming next. Now, let's go back to the year 1650, to the port of Amsterdam, where this nightmare began. To understand the Flying Dutchman, you first have to understand just how much money was riding on every single voyage around the Cape of Good Hope. In the middle of the 17th century, the Netherlands was the wealthiest nation in Europe, and the engine driving that wealth was the Dutch East India Company. Their ships carried spices, silk, tea, and gold from the East Indies back to the ports of Europe, and a single successful voyage could turn an ordinary captain into a rich man for the rest of his life. But the price of that fortune was paid in blood. Ships sailed south along the African coastline for months before facing the single most dangerous stretch of ocean on the planet, the passage around the Cape of Good Hope. Sailors did not call it the Cape of Good Hope. They called it the Cape of Storms. This is the point where the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean crash into each other, producing swells that can rise 40 feet in the air and winds that hit 80 miles an hour, shredding sails and snapping masts as if they were matchsticks. The Dutch East India Company lost dozens of ships in these waters every single year, and thousands of sailors disappeared into water so deep their bodies were never found. This is the world that Captain Hendrick van der Decken sailed in. Historical records suggest he was a real man, born in the Netherlands, into a family that had lost everything to bankruptcy while he was still a boy. That early poverty planted an obsession in him, an obsession with wealth and status that would define the rest of his life. He joined the Dutch East India Company at just 16 years old, and by the age of 25, he was already commanding his own ship. Other captains called him reckless. His own crew called him obsessed. But the company loved him, because Van der Decken completed the deadly Cape crossing faster than any other captain in the fleet. Speed meant money, and Van der Decken was addicted to both. In 1680, his ship left the port of Amsterdam loaded with valuable cargo, bound for Batavia, the city we now know as Jakarta. Everything went according to plan until they reached the Cape Colony and prepared to make the crossing that had claimed so many ships before them. His first mate came to him with a warning. Storm season was closing in fast. Other captains anchored nearby were choosing to wait it out rather than risk the passage. Decken refused. Every day spent waiting in port was a day of profit lost, and profit was the only thing that mattered to him. On April 4th, the storm hit. The sky turned black in minutes. Winds tore across the deck at 70 miles an hour, waves 30 feet high slammed over the railings, and men who had been standing on deck seconds earlier were simply gone, swept overboard before they could even scream. The crew begged him to turn back. The first mate physically pleaded with him, warning him that the rigging was failing and that continuing forward would kill every man on board. And according to the legend that has survived for 3 centuries, Decken's answer was to pull a pistol and threaten to shoot the first man who questioned his orders again. The most chilling version of the story claims he screamed into the storm itself, swearing he would round that cape no matter the cost, refusing to yield to the wind, the waves, or anything else that stood in his way. The ship pushed on. Masts cracked and split under the strain. Water poured over the deck, dragging sailors into the black water below. Still, Decken would not turn. He lashed himself to the ship's wheel and steered directly into the largest waves he could find. The ship's carpenter later claimed he heard the captain raging against the storm itself at the height of the chaos, vowing that nothing in heaven or on earth would make him give up his course. And then, the ship vanished. Witnesses on the shoreline said the ship's lanterns simply went dark somewhere around midnight. No wreckage ever washed ashore. Not a single survivor was ever found. The Dutch East India Company recorded the vessel as lost with all hands, 147 men swallowed by the sea without a trace. Except, it wasn't gone at all. 3 months later, another Dutch merchant vessel was making its own crossing around the Cape of Good Hope when the lookout spotted something sailing toward them from the south, directly into the wind. At first, they assumed it was just another trading ship making the same dangerous journey. Then they got close enough to see the details, and the details made their blood run cold. The ship was old, decades out of date in her design. Her sails hung in torn, rotting strips, yet somehow they were still catching wind that should not have been able to move them at all. The hull was smashed and battered, as if it had been thrown against rocks again and again. And standing at the wheel was a man in a captain's coat, his face frozen in an expression of pure rage and madness. The crew recognized the ship instantly. It was Decken's vessel, the same one that had disappeared into the storm 3 months earlier. They tried to signal it, waving lanterns, shouting across the water. There was no response. The ghost ship sailed directly toward their bow, and the crew braced for a collision that never came. The phantom vessel passed straight through their hull as if it were made of fog and moonlight, and the sailors reported a wave of freezing cold air washing over them as it did. Then, it disappeared into the mist, leaving a terrified crew wondering if they had all imagined it together. They had not imagined it, because 2 weeks later, another ship reported the exact same encounter. Same location, same ghost ship, same spectral crew standing frozen on deck. And this time, something even worse happened. The ship that witnessed the Flying Dutchman that second time sank 3 days later, in calm seas, with no storm and no explanation. It simply began taking on water and went down, taking half its crew with it. That was the moment the legend was truly born. Word of it spread from port to port, carried by sailors who swore on their own lives that every detail was true. And soon, other captains all across the shipping lanes began reporting the exact same thing. A ghost ship near the Cape of Good Hope, always appearing right before a disaster, always crewed by figures who should have been dead for a century. By the early 1700s, this was no longer just a story sailors whispered over rum in port taverns. It had become an entire code of survival. Sailors developed strict, unspoken rules for what to do if the Flying Dutchman ever crossed your path. Never acknowledge the ship, never wave, never signal, never respond in any way. And above everything else, never accept anything offered by her crew, because according to the legend, the Flying Dutchman would sometimes try to make contact. Her crew would row longboats across open water to deliver letters and packages to living ships. These letters were addressed to people who had been dead for decades, written in languages no living sailor could read. Sailors believed that accepting one of those letters was said to doom your ship to sink within days, or worse, condemn you to join the phantom crew forever, sailing an endless ocean with no port and no rest. The only way to survive an encounter was total refusal and the fastest possible escape. But this is where the story stops being folklore and starts becoming something much harder to explain away, because the sightings did not stop. And some of them were witnessed, documented, and signed by people whose entire careers depended on telling the truth. The most famous sighting on record happened in July of 1881 aboard the HMS Bacchante, a Royal Navy training vessel sailing near the Cape of Good Hope. Among the crew that night was a young midshipman named Prince George of Wales, a man who would one day become King George V of England. It was 4 o'clock in the morning when the officer of the watch spotted something impossible on the horizon. A ship was approaching, glowing with an eerie red light that seemed to come from somewhere inside the vessel itself, moving at a speed that made no sense given there was almost no wind at all. As it closed the distance, the details became unmistakable. An old Dutch design, decades out of fashion. Tattered sails that should never have been able to catch a breeze, and a silent crew of shadowy figures moving across her deck. Prince George and the ship's captain were both called up to witness it firsthand. All of them watched as the glowing ship crossed directly in front of their bow, close enough that a normal vessel would have responded to a signal. This one gave nothing. It simply sailed past, bathed in that unnatural red light, and vanished into the darkness as though it had never been there at all. This was not a rumor. This was an official Royal Navy log entry, written down, witnessed, and signed by multiple officers on board, including a future King of England. And the story does not end there. Hours later, at 10 o'clock that same morning, the sailor who had first spotted the ghost ship fell from the ship's rigging, 70 feet down to the deck, and died instantly on impact. The crew was convinced the Flying Dutchman had marked him the moment he laid eyes on her. Prince George himself later wrote about the incident in his own diary, describing the sighting and the sailor's death as two events that were undeniably connected. Sightings continued throughout the following decades. In 1823, a British captain reported an ancient Dutch ship off the coast of South Africa that appeared to be burning, glowing with an unnatural light, yet producing no smoke and no spreading flame. It sailed alongside his ship for nearly 10 minutes before simply winking out of existence. In 1935, a British Royal Navy training ship reported that dozens of sailors on deck watched an old-fashioned sailing vessel appear out of nowhere, sail toward them, and then dissolve completely before their eyes. But of every sighting in 300 years, none is quite as haunting or as heavily witnessed as what happened on a calm, ordinary afternoon on the South African coast in March of 1939. It happened at Glencairn Beach, just south of Cape Town. More than 60 people were enjoying a perfectly clear day. Families building sandcastles, couples walking along the shoreline, local fishermen preparing their boats for the evening. The sky was cloudless. The sea was flat and calm. Visibility stretched for miles. At around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, someone pointed out to sea and screamed, and every single person on that beach turned to see a massive, square-rigged sailing ship straight out of the 1600s, gliding across the water in full sail. This was not some distant shape on the horizon. Witnesses said it was close, maybe 400 yards from the shore, close enough to see the weathered, rotting wooden planks of the hull, close enough to see the torn strips of rigging, close enough to see figures moving on deck that seemed almost translucent, like shadows cast onto smoke. And the ship made no sound at all. No creaking wood, no waves slapping against the hull, no wind snapping through the sails. Just complete, unnatural silence as it moved across the water in front of dozens of stunned witnesses. A professional photographer on the beach that day managed to raise his camera and focus on the ship. But the moment he pressed the shutter, the vessel began to fade. Not sailing away, not disappearing over the horizon, but dissolving like morning mist burning off in sunlight. Within 30 seconds, it was completely gone. Local newspapers sent reporters to interview the witnesses, and the descriptions lined up almost perfectly. An old three-masted Dutch merchant ship, torn sails, moving directly against the wind with no visible means of propulsion, silent, and then simply gone. Maritime experts who investigated afterward could find no historical reenactment vessel, no film production, and no ship of any kind that should have been in those waters that day. 60 ordinary people in broad daylight all watched the exact same impossible thing happen at once. So, what is actually happening out there? Is this truly a curse that has followed one captain and his crew across 3 centuries? Or is there a rational explanation hiding underneath 300 years of consistent testimony? The leading scientific explanation is a phenomenon called a superior mirage, more commonly known by its old sailor's name, the Fata Morgana. Here is how it works. When a layer of cold, dense air settles directly beneath a layer of warmer air, light passing through that boundary bends at unusual angles, almost like the atmosphere itself becomes a giant lens. This bending can lift objects that are actually below the horizon and make them appear to float in the sky. It can stretch a ship's silhouette, compress it, or make a small vessel far away appear enormous and close. The Cape of Good Hope is almost a perfect laboratory for this effect. The cold Benguela current flowing up from Antarctica constantly collides with warm air rising off the African continent, creating exactly the kind of temperature inversion that produces a Fata Morgana. This could explain why sightings cluster in this one specific stretch of ocean, why ships seem to appear from nowhere and vanish just as suddenly, and why a completely ordinary modern vessel might look ancient and distorted when seen through those bent layers of light. But here's the problem with that explanation, and it is a big one. A Fata Morgana typically projects an image from an object that is somewhere between 10 and 20 miles away. Yet witness after witness, across 3 centuries, described the Flying Dutchman at a distance of only a few hundred feet. The crew of the HMS Bacchante estimated the ship was only 200 yards away, close enough to make out individual crew members standing on deck. A mirage stretched across 20 miles of atmosphere simply should not be able to produce that kind of fine, close-up detail. There is another theory involving bioluminescent plankton, tiny organisms that glow when disturbed by movement in the water, sometimes outlining underwater currents or the shape of a sunken wreck lying just beneath the surface. But bioluminescence produces a diffuse, soft glow, not a solid structure with visible rigging, sails, and moving figures on deck. And it certainly cannot explain a sighting that happened in broad daylight, with a cloudless sky and 60 witnesses standing on a beach. The most unsettling theory of all comes from maritime historians, and it has nothing to do with light or plankton. The waters around the Cape of Good Hope hold more than 3,000 documented shipwrecks, many of them from the exact era of the Dutch East India Company. Under extremely rare conditions, powerful ocean currents can dislodge a sunken wreck from the seabed, and if that wreck still holds trapped pockets of air, it can rise and briefly float on the surface before sinking back into the depths. If that theory is correct, It would explain the sudden appearances and disappearances. It would explain why the ship always looks ancient, damaged, and out of place. It would explain why sightings keep happening in the same stretch of ocean, year after year, century after century. But it also raises a far darker question. If people really are watching a real ship rise briefly from the seafloor, then what they are looking at is not a ghost at all. It is a tomb. A mass grave for sailors who drowned centuries ago, surfacing for a few impossible seconds before sinking back into permanent darkness. Whatever the truth is, the Flying Dutchman has never loosened its grip on human imagination, and it is worth asking why this particular ghost story has survived for 300 years when so many others have faded into obscurity. In 1843, the composer Richard Wagner turned the legend into an opera, reshaping Van der Decken from a cursed tyrant into a tragic romantic figure searching for redemption through the love of a faithful woman. More than a century later, the Pirates of the Caribbean films reimagined the Flying Dutchman once again, this time as a supernatural vessel commanded by Davy Jones, ferrying the souls of the dead between worlds. Both versions are entertaining, and both are extremely far removed from the original horror of the story. Because the legend was never really about redemption. It was about a captain so consumed by greed and pride that he damned every single man under his command for the sake of profit and speed. The real horror of the Flying Dutchman was never the supernatural crew. It was the entirely human decision that put them there in the first place. And that is really the reason the story has never died. It taps directly into one of humanity's oldest and deepest fears. The fear of the ocean's total indifference to human life, and the fear that some mistakes, some choices, can never be undone. Between 1600 and 1800, the Dutch East India Company alone lost more than 400 ships in the waters around the Cape of Good Hope, an average of 2 ships every single year for 2 centuries straight, each one carrying 100 to 150 men. Over 60,000 sailors disappeared into those waters and were never recovered. The Flying Dutchman became the symbol of every single one of those men. A reminder that the ocean takes everything eventually, and that greed dressed up as ambition has a body count that history rarely bothers to record. So what do we actually know for certain? We know the legend did not start as entertainment. It started as a warning, carved directly out of real tragedy, real loss, and a real culture of sailors who understood exactly how deadly these waters truly were. We know that sightings have continued into the modern era. In 2011, a fishing crew off Cape Town reported watching an old sailing ship appear inside a bank of fog for almost 3 minutes before it dissolved completely. In 2016, a tourist captured distant footage that some viewers insist shows the Flying Dutchman, though skeptics argue it is nothing more than a modern yacht caught in strange lighting. And in one particularly strange case, a research vessel using sonar detected what appeared to be a 17th century Dutch merchant ship resting roughly 400 feet below the surface. When the same team returned 2 weeks later to investigate further, the wreck had completely vanished from that location. Skeptics will always be able to find an explanation. Mirages caused by temperature inversion, hallucinations brought on by isolation, exhaustion, and stress at sea. Modern ships misidentified in poor visibility, shared psychological delusions spreading through a crew, surfacing shipwrecks, glowing plankton, and maybe every single one of them is right. Maybe 300 years of sightings really can be reduced entirely to science, psychology, and the strange behavior of light through unstable air. But that still does not explain the consistency. Why do witnesses separated by decades, sometimes by entire centuries, with no way of coordinating their stories, all describe exactly the same ship? The same location near the Cape of Good Hope. The same old Dutch design with torn sails. The same sudden appearance and even more sudden disappearance. The same eerie silence and the same shadowy, motionless crew. It does not explain the credibility of the people reporting it. This was not only superstitious sailors swapping stories over rum in a dockside tavern. This was a future King of England. This was trained Royal Navy officers whose entire careers depended on accurate, honest reporting. This was 60 ordinary people standing together on a beach in broad daylight. These were people with absolutely nothing to gain and quite a lot to lose by claiming they had seen something so far outside the ordinary. And it does not fully explain the deaths that so often followed these sightings. The sailor on the HMS Bacchante, who fell to his death only hours after spotting the ship. The vessel that sank in calm seas. Days after her crew claimed to have watched the Flying Dutchman pass through their hull. Coincidence? Almost certainly. But a coincidence that has repeated itself in eerily similar form for 300 years. The truth is, we simply do not know. Scientists can explain exactly how a Fata Morgana bends light, but they cannot prove that is what every single witness actually saw. Historians can document the staggering scale of ships lost around the Cape, but they cannot confirm that Van der Decken's vessel is truly the one still rising from the depths. Psychologists can describe how mass hallucination spreads through a group, but they cannot fully explain how 60 separate people, standing in perfect daylight with a clear sky above them, all hallucinated the exact same three-masted ghost ship at the exact same moment. And that, more than anything else, is what makes the Flying Dutchman the most terrifying ghost ship in maritime history. Not because we can prove it is supernatural, but because it exists in that unbearable space between the explainable and the impossible. The space where legend and evidence refuse to fully separate from each other. Somewhere off the coast of South Africa, in the churning waters near the Cape of Good Hope, something is still out there. Maybe it is nothing more than an optical illusion, born from layers of temperature-shifted air. Maybe it is a centuries-old wreck occasionally freed from the seafloor. Or maybe, just maybe, Captain Hendrick van der Decken is still out there tonight, still fighting to round that cape, still refusing to turn back, still sailing through a storm that should have killed him hundreds of years ago. So, if you ever find yourself near those waters, and you see an old ship with torn sails and a strange red glow on the horizon, do exactly what sailors have done for 300 years. Look away, because some legends exist for a reason. And the Cape of Storms rarely spares those who underestimate its mysteries. What do you believe? Is this a trick of science or a curse that refuses to die? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Thank you for watching Bilge Beyond, and I will see you in the next mystery.